Chapter 12 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 12. Karangarua River. With Douglas again. Topography. Futa Camp. Floods. Castles Flat. Bark Camp. Twain Gorge. Alone. Regina Creek. On September 23rd, Mr. Ned Gibb, who has a store on the Waikukupa River, came up to the Waiho on a visit to the diggers, and I returned with him. We had a long talk about golf, for he was a caddie at St Andrews before he came to New Zealand, and hadn't had a good pitch about the old game for nearly 30 years. After staying a night at his house on the beach, I continued my journey to Gillespie's on my horse, with my goods and chattels in 2 saddlebags strapped one on each side. When a few miles from Gillespie's, I discovered that one of my rolls had fallen off, so started back at a gallop to pick it up, because I had been riding close to the surf on the hard sand, and was afraid that it would have gone out to sea. After going about a quarter of a mile, I saw it floating 50 yards out, beyond the first line of breakers, and travelling up the coast with a strong current which sets up the beach while the tide is going out. Before I could go in after it, the bag sank, and I had to sorrowfully jog on to Gillespie's without it. A week later, the mailman, coming down the beach, picked up the contents at various places, scattered over the sand some miles north of where I dropped it. As generally happens on these occasions, the most precious things were lost, namely, 2 pounds of boot nails, tobacco 7 pounds, and 24 quarter plates exposed on the Franz Joseph Glacier. On reaching Gillespie's, I found a note from Douglas to say that he was at Mr. Scott's farm on the Karangarua River flats. I therefore went on, crossing Cook River and Saltwater Creek, one of the worst and most treacherous fords on the beach, and reached Scott's that evening. Here I found that Douglas had been suffering greatly from rheumatism all the winter, and though not really fit for it, he was determined to come up the river, at any rate as far as he could. For some time previous to this, the government were desirous of finding a pass by which a road or trek for tourists could be taken from the Hermitage to the west coast. This pass they required to be, quote, free of snow and ice for 3 months in the year, end quote. It was well known from the eastern side of the divide that no such pass existed from the head of the Godley to Mount Sefton, and Douglas had been up the Copeland River, a branch of the Karangarua, in 1892, and reported no such passes required up that river. Our work, therefore, in the season of 1893 to 94 had been the exploration of the Waiho and Cook Rivers, to prove that there was no route such as they required by those valleys, and also to get reconnaissance surveys of this new country completed. Now, however, we had instructions to explore the Karangarua and its branches, and report on the possibility of a trek up this river, over some saddle, into the Landsborough River, and down that valley to a pass found by Mr. T. N. Broderick from Lake Ohau on the eastern side of the divide. This would, I pointed out, be a very roundabout route, but as it would combine both a report on the route and an exploration of the only district in South Westland still unexplored, the authorities decided to have it inspected. The Karangarua had been traversed up to Castles Flat, a large open basin in the hills, 12 miles from Scott's house, or 16 from the sea. Beyond that point, the Twain and the main branch were both unexplored. 6 miles above Scott's, the Copeland River, draining the divide from Mount Stokes, La Perouse, to Mount Sefton, joins the Karangarua, and on Castles Flat, the Twain, draining the divide from Mount Sefton to Mount Monga, flows into the main stream, which takes its rise from the northern end of the Hooker Range. The topography of this district is rather puzzling and somewhat difficult to describe clearly. The dividing range, after leaving Stokes, 10,101 feet, runs practically south for 4 miles, and then circles round in a southwesterly direction for another 4 miles, passing the Footstool, 9,097 feet, Sefton, 10,359 feet, to Mount Brunner. From there it takes a southerly direction to Mount Monga, 8,335 feet, a distance of some 2 or 3 miles, and again strikes in a southwesterly direction to the Haast Pass, upwards of 40 miles away. From Stokes, the Copeland Range branches off, and divides Cook River from the Copeland River, and from Mount Sefton, the Karangarua Range runs slightly north of west for 12 miles, dividing the latter river from the Twain River. From Mount Monga, the Hooker Range runs for 5 miles, to Mount Howitt, due west, separating the Macaro Glacier from the head of the Twain River, and then turns in a southwesterly direction, continuing for about 30 miles, parallel with the dividing range, and with it enclosing the Landsborough River, which flows from the Macaro Glacier. From Mount Howitt, a short precipitous offshoot runs parallel to the Karangarua River for about 7 miles, and divides the Twain River from the Karangarua main stream, which takes its rise from just under Mount Howitt, and has a saddle leading into the Macaro Glacier. The Hooker Range, therefore, has cut off the Karangarua Valley from the dividing range. The so-called main branch is really not the most important, and is strictly speaking a tributary of the Twain River, but when the lower part of the valley was traversed, these branches received their names, and they have been retained for convenience. In referring to them, I shall consider the Twain River the tributary of the so-called main branch. On the 1st of October, we left Scott's house and camped some 4 miles above the farm, at the point where the river leaves the hills. We pitched the batwing in some tutu scrub on a sheltered flat, and remained there for a week. From here we blazed or cleared a track up the river for 3 miles, 1 mile above the inflow of the Copeland River, where we built a futtah and made our second camp. A futtah is a small shelter of bark and canvas, raised off the ground, in which to leave provisions and stores sheltered from the weather, wekas, and rats. The one we made here was 4 feet off the ground, with a floor of 7 feet by 4 feet, and 5 feet from floor to roof. It was built of rata bark and saplings, and will in all probability stand for several years. 2 of us put it up in half a day. On Saturday the 6th, 3 horses arrived by previous arrangement from Scott's at Camp 1, and we packed enough provisions in the futtah to last us for 5 months, with the help of birds. Above this camp our hard work began, for we had to carry everything up on our shoulders, this being the last point to which a horse could go. The stores we brought up to the futtah were flour, soda and acid, side of bacon, rice, sugar, dry figs, chocolate, cocoa, tea, jam, treacle, a splendid thing for this work, oatmeal, a few tins of sardines and meat, 2 half-axes, 2 bill hooks, a small frying pan for baking, 3 billies of different sizes, 3 mugs, 2 plates, a tin prospecting dish, ice axes, ropes, instruments, cameras, plates, 2 batwings, 3 flies, biscuits, soap, candles, matches, tobacco, alpine climbing lantern, salt and pepper. The provisions were supposed to last for 5 months, with the help of birds. The luxuries, such as cooking utensils and batwing, would only be taken to the head of the Karangarua. Any further work in the Landsborough or Twain we intended to do in light order, that is, with a fly only, and the stores. The half-axes were necessary in case we had to cut a tree down to spar the river or a bad creek. The bill hooks were for blazing a track. By way of amusement, I had Cook's Voyages, Milton's Poems, and Pliny's Letters, in pocket editions, also 2 packs of cards. The latter I found most useful when alone, as I played Patience, or had a game of cribbage, right hand against left, by way of a change. It is curious how one generally has a tendency to cheat in favour of the left hand. A blanket each and 1 spare one between us, sewing materials and boot nails must be added to the above list, and in order to remind myself that I was a civilized being, and only temporarily a savage, I took a toothbrush and a comb. For medicinal purposes, Douglas carried, quote, painkiller, end quote, and pills, and I, quote, eucalyptus, end quote, depending on natural medicines for other things. Since I had last seen Douglas, he had lost Betsy. She had been with him on a spur of Ryan's Peak, and disappeared in a fog on their way down, no doubt having fallen into a fissure in the rocks, or perhaps over a precipice. Douglas had written asking me to bring him down a, quote, various pup, end quote. The greater the variety of breed, the better. But curious as it may seem, I could not get one at a reasonable price. It is really remarkable how valuable mongrel pups become when you want one. A dog which the owner was on the point of drowning yesterday is worth £2 today when you make inquiries. Consequently, no sale results. The owner loses a sure half-sovereign, and the puppy probably loses his life in a week or 2 by running against a stray bullet which happens to be travelling near him. Douglas, however, had picked up a pretty little dog, and we decided to name him after the first bird he found. Soon after we started, he discovered a nest of blue duck's eggs, so we dubbed him Eggs. It was fortunate that we did not wait for him to catch a bird, for he turned out to be quite useless, and only caught one weka some 6 months later. Poor dog! It was not his fault, even then, because the weka charged him, and he had to kill it. A week of wet weather followed, during which we staged 3 or 4 loads about 2 miles up the river, and left them under a piece of canvas. The place we named Poison Camp, being the scene of one of Douglas's many extraordinary escapes when working alone as he used to do. A few years before, he had started up the river by himself to explore it, and got as far as this camp with his stores. From here he went on to Castle's Flat to reconnoitre the route, and returned in the evening, intending to move his camp next day. He had with him a tin or 2 of sardines, and one of them poisoned him. He was 10 days there by himself, very ill, and sometimes delirious, finding himself more than once away in the bush without any recollection of leaving the Batwing. It was also raining a great deal, so besides sickness, he was nearly all the time wet. No one but Douglas would have survived such an experience. This misfortune, of course, terminated his exploration of the river, for a time at any rate. On reaching Scott's again, he opened another tin, and gave the cat some of its contents, to see if they were the cause of his illness. The cat only ate 1 or 2 of the sardines, and died a few hours afterwards, which was fairly good proof of the exceptional quality of those fish. The return of his rheumatism compelled Douglas to go back to Scott's on the 17th, and in 3 days a young fellow arrived at the camp to go on up the river with me. While alone at the foot of camp, I had the opportunity of seeing how quickly a Westland river can rise in heavy rain. On the 19th, having been up the river with another load, I turned in early in the evening, and at 9 p.m. the weather was quite clear. I do not know when it clouded over or began to rain, but at 2 a.m. I woke up, finding the Batwing flooded by 3 or 4 inches of water in which I was lying. I got up and drained the camp with my ice axe, and could hear the river, which was about 20 yards away, coming down in a regular flood. At 5 a.m. I went across to the bank and marked the height of the water, which in the early morning light looked splendid. There was not a boulder to be seen, and branches of trees were careering down in the swirling yellow water. Opposite the camp, there were some stones 10 or 15 feet in height, and they were invisible. Turning in again soon, I slept till 10 o'clock, and on waking found the sun shining brightly, and the river already lower. I afterwards measured the rise and fall of the water carefully, and found that between the commencement of the rain and 5 a.m., say 5 hours, the river had risen 15 feet, and by 4 p.m. had fallen 8 feet, regaining its normal level some time during that night. The great rise is due to the course of the river being narrow at this point. From the Foote to Poison Camp was, for a West Coast river, good going, but beyond there was half a mile of very rough boulder travelling, not nearly so bad as Cook River, but quite rough enough. It is purely a matter of comparison as to good and bad travelling on these rivers. I have no doubt whatever that anyone who had no previous experience of a West Coast river would consider the piece from the Foote to Poison Camp decidedly rough going, as the stones are from 1 to 3 feet in diameter, and the half mile above the latter place he would only be able to describe in superlatives, for Cook River would either be left undescribed or the description would be unparliamentary. When I speak of good travelling, I mean only good compared with the average river going. It is really quite bad enough. On the 22nd, my new companion and I went up with heavy loads. I had 80 pounds and he had 65 pounds, to Castle's Flat, and when doing the last half mile were very sorry we had not made 2 trips with light loads, instead of 1 with heavy. At 4 o'clock we reached a knoll or hillock, covered with rata trees, 3/4 of a mile above the lower end of the flat, and here we camped, about 12 miles from Scott's. 2 more days were spent in staging up some of the stores left at Poison Camp, and by the 25th we had made everything snug at Camp 3, putting a bark wall 6 feet high in a circle of 12 feet in diameter right round the camp. As we intended to make this our base of operations, and as it would probably be left standing for 3 months, we made it very substantial, pitching a large 7 by 4 foot batwing and 10 by 12 foot fly inside the bark wall. Bark Camp, or Camp 3, though airy, was the most palatial residence we ever had the whole time we were out, But of course it was only our head camp, and unless wet weather compelled us to stay in it, we should be away for weeks at a time. As it turned out, however, I had nearly 2 months on this flat, as will be seen later. Similar flats are to be found on many of the West Coast rivers, luckily for the unfortunate explorer. It would be heartbreaking work to toil up narrow, boulder-filled valleys or rock-bound gorges, without some hope of a piece of easy going, and the relief of a mile of flat walking after several days of crawling and climbing over large boulders is beyond belief. One feels quite a new man, and after leaving the flat, ready to attack the inevitable gorge with renewed vigour. 1 or 2 rivers, however, are without any easy travelling for their whole length. Cook's, for instance, was more or less all rough and certainly had no flat, and Douglas speaks of the Turnbull River further south, which he explored, as having 16 miles of gorges out of a total length of 18 miles. A small flat of half a mile on such a river would make the whole difference to the exploration, for instead of being a grind, it would be a pleasure. Like most of these basins in the heart of the ranges, Castle's Flat is the centre of some magnificent scenery. In fact, from the time the low country is left behind until we come back down the rivers, notes of admiration are necessary so far as scenery is concerned. It is a level patch of ground surrounded on all sides by high rocky mountains, which form an oval basin 1 1/2 mile long and 1 mile wide. About the middle of this basin was Queen's Knoll, at the foot of which we made Bark Camp. It is a matter for scientific men to decide how these flats are formed, but here I believe a lake existed at one time. The surrounding mountains are steep and bare, with rocky slopes incapable of holding any glacial deposits, rising for some thousands of feet very abruptly out of the flat. At the southern end, or the corner, as I named it, the main branch of the Karangarua comes in, through a rocky gorge and over high cataracts. On the eastern side, the Twain River and Regina Creek flow through similar great gorges and cataracts, divided by a high conical hill of rock, and join the main river about the middle of the flat, the former about 1/4 mile above Bark Camp, and the latter immediately opposite, across the stream. At the northern or lower end of the basin is a large bar of glacial deposit, augmented probably by slips from the hills. This bar has, perhaps, caused the river to flow more slowly, and consequently to deposit a large amount of small gravel, gradually filling up the valley to its present level, and at the same time spreading out to a greater breadth. But I think it is more probable that a lake has existed here in the past, for there are numerous terraces on the flat, showing that it was once considerably higher, and it has since been cut down by the river. The bar of old moraine at the lower end would have caused the river to back up and form a lake, while the constant denudation of the hills in the upper valley, and the numerous slips of which there is evidence, would by slow degrees have filled up the valley, until the lake ceased to exist. The channel through the bar has then, in the course of time, become lower, and allowed the river to reach its present level, leaving the flat high and dry, and also the above-mentioned terraces. In the middle of the river opposite Bark Camp was an island which, with Queen's Knoll, is nearly all that remains of an old terminal moraine. They are both composed of great boulders, heaped up promiscuously, amongst which large rata trees are growing. The island had a single kiwi on it, so I named it Crusoe's Island. The rest of the flat was lightly timbered and covered with very dense scrub of 10 to 20 feet in height, until some of the higher terraces were reached, and these had older and larger trees on them. There were also 3 or 4 small pakahis, or spaces of open grass, perfectly useless for pastoral purposes, but pleasant to walk over after emerging from the scrub. The general level of the flat was 680 feet above the sea. My present plan was to follow the Twain to its source, and cross over a saddle into the McKerrow Glacier and Landsborough River, follow that valley down to Broderick's Pass, some 25 miles or more, and then, returning to the McKerrow Glacier, find my way over into the Karangarua main branch, and follow it down to Castle's Flat again. This would probably have taken 2 months, if the weather was not unusually bad. On the 25th, we forded the main branch, just above the inflow of the Twain River, and blazed our way with billhooks along the south bank of the latter stream, hoping to find a route through the decidedly ugly-looking gorge. In this we were disappointed, for after a day's hard cutting, we emerged from the stunted vegetation onto a sheer smooth face of rock, rising hundreds of feet out of the water, without any chance of a route. As we got further into the gorge, the hillsides became steeper, and the vegetation more stunted, and at last it was evident that we should hardly be able to traverse this side with heavy loads, though we might do it in our present unburdened condition. Telling my mate to await my return, I went on to see what the place looked like round a rocky point ahead. The sides now were practically sheer precipices, and I was clinging onto the scrub entirely. Having at last come to the end of the vegetation and reached the bare rock, I could see that no man could get along on this bank, for the rock was smooth and perpendicular, throwing out short buttresses of rounded water or ice-worn rock, affording no more hold than the side of a house. Hearing the water a long way below, I caught hold of a shrub above with one hand and leant out to look at the river, and it proved to be 200 or 300 feet below me. To show how precarious a hold the vegetation has in such places, my weight caused the whole mass of scrub for 20 feet above me to leave the rock and stand out a foot or two in a perfect network of roots, with apparently no hold on the cliff for 20 feet, where there was evidently a crevice or a ledge. It can be imagined that I did not waste many minutes getting back to where the side was sloping less steeply, having no wish to further test the strength of the roots. I believe if the roots were cut along the ledge above, that the whole network of vegetation would fall outwards like a curtain for 20 or 30 feet. The gorge, now that we could see into it, was truly magnificent. The south bank rose nearly sheer, that is, precipice after precipice, with ledges here and there for some 3,000 feet, straight out of the water. In places, great overhanging rocks frowned down upon us from above, and seemed to be ready to topple forward as we climbed along beneath them. At one point the rocks leaned over to such an extent that a stone would have fallen 1,000 feet without touching the cliff once on its descent. The opposite side sloped back at an angle of nearly 40 degrees, and was covered with luxuriant bush. Through this gorge the river descends some 500 feet, in about 300 yards, over large boulders, up to and over 40 feet in diameter, which are jammed in magnificent confusion into the narrow rock-walled channel, forming a cataract to which I have never seen its equal. Above the cataract the gorge continues with its stupendous walls for over a mile and a half, and then the valley takes a bend away southwards toward the glaciers of Mount Sefton. This river descends 2,500 feet in 3 1/4 miles through 2 gorges. It was quite evident that the north side would be the best to attempt, for it was not by any means so precipitous, and had trees growing on it which would afford shelter and firewood. The Twain was without doubt going to give us some trouble, and it would be by no means easy to take our loads through so bad a gorge. My companion thought it very grand, and was surprised when I told him that of course we should take our camp through if possible. He seemed to have some idea that we should make no further attempt to get up the river. The next day, sending him down to the Futta for a load, I traversed some of the larger creeks below the flat, and brought up a 50 of flour in the evening. And on the 27th we both went to Poison Camp for the rest of our stores there, spending the afternoon in completing our shelter and bathing in a fine pool close to camp. During these 2 days my mate was somewhat silent, and occasionally sounding me as to the idea of going on into such bad-looking country. He couldn't understand how we were to find our way if no one had been in front of us, nor could I excite his enthusiasm by saying we were the first 2 in that country. I was hardly surprised, therefore, on Sunday morning the 28th, to find that he was going back to Scott's before it was too late. I remonstrated with him, but all to no purpose. "It's too lonesome," he said, "up here. I'm going back." "As long as we are together," I suggested, "it would not be lonesome." "Oh, well," he answered, "I'm not the sort that likes being stuck away up here anyhow. I like seeing life." I admit the idea of anyone "seeing life" in South Westland, or anywhere else on the coast, amused me somewhat, and as I knew he had never been away from the district, I said, "Good heavens, man, where can you see life?" "At Gillespie's, of course," was the answer, given with considerable surprise at my ignorance. A somewhat feeble description of Gillespie's has already been given, so it may be imagined the idea of "seeing life" there was rather too funny to be taken seriously, and I fear that the guffaw which greeted his answer hurt his feelings. He left me alone in my glory that morning, taking down a message to Douglas to try and send someone else, and also some letters to post. The fact of the matter is that he was frightened of the rough work, like most other young fellows of the district, for, except south of the Haast River, it is hardly possible to induce a man to go into the ranges. This has been Douglas's experience in the past, and is the reason why he did so much of his work alone. The weather up to this point had been rather finer than usual, but on the 28th it began to rain, and continued for a week without interruption, confining me to my shelter with little to do. Luckily I had brought up a flute, but something went wrong with the works, and the lower 3 notes refused to make any sound. There are not many tunes which one can play on 3 notes only, so beyond several hours of vigorous puffing to get more than a wheeze out of the low notes, the instrument afforded little amusement, but a great deal of hard work. Heavy rain has its advantages in the ranges, as well as its drawbacks, for, when amongst the great rock peaks, the waterfalls are wonderfully fine. One day during this week, I counted no less than 86 good falls within half a mile of camp, varying from 2,000 to 3,000 feet in height, those coming down the great rock slopes of Mount McGloin being magnificent. This peak is situated on the southern side of the flat, and its bare rock slopes rise to a very steep angle, and in places sheer precipices, to a height of over 5,000 feet above the flat. The weather cleared on Guy Fawkes Day, but as the rain had been cold and snow had fallen on the tops, the river was not high. Deciding, therefore, to explore the creek I had named Regina, I forded across from the camp to Crusoe's Island, a distance of 80 yards, and again from there to the other side, another 50 yards, finding the stream just strong and deep enough to necessitate the use of a pole. Regina Creek joined the river at this point, after descending through a boulder-filled gorge, and over a grand cataract of 700 feet in a quarter of a mile. Not only is the course of the creek filled with large stones, but the hillsides, far up into the bush, present as rough a piece of travelling as I have seen since Cook's River the year before. It took no less than an hour to go the last 6 chains at the top of the cataract, through large forest trees growing on and amongst boulders of all sizes, up to 60 feet in height and 200 feet in girth. Sometimes deep gaps between these would be spanned by an old tree trunk, over which was the only way to cross, and very uncanny it was. One never could be sure that the bridge would bear, and the hole in most cases had water at the bottom, in semi-darkness, in which I could see my reflection as I passed over. At the top of the cataract the valley, as usual, opened out into a broad basin lined with bold precipitous mountains, at the bottom of which the stream flowed through a small flat. A mile above the great cataract a smaller one was met with, beyond which the valley again opened out and showed another rock-bound basin, with a small secondary glacier at its head, which supplies the creek. Though Regina Creek is on a smaller scale than the Twain Gorge, it has very grand scenery, and would eclipse many favourite resorts in Europe with its attractions. I should, however, prefer not to be the unfortunate man who has to engineer a track or road through those terrible boulders, which have to be negotiated before the upper valley is reached. At the foot of the cataract there was another instance of that reasoning power of trees already referred to. On an isolated boulder in the stream 2 large rata trees were growing, and evidently found their rocky home too small to give sufficient nourishment. No doubt when young saplings they had quite a good time, but now they were full-grown trees and had to find better means of support. The rock was 10 yards from the bank, and one of the trees had sent out a sucker, or arm, across the intervening riverbed to the richer soil of the terrace. The sucker was about the thickness of a man's arm, and had twined round 2 stones, about 1 and 2 feet in diameter, on its way to the bank. On reaching the terrace it had lifted itself from the riverbed, and raised with it the 2 stones, which were to be seen quite 4 feet from the ground, firmly held in its clutches. The 6th and 7th were wet again, and the river rose too high to allow me to ford it safely, so instead of going to the Twain Gorge, I carried the traverse up to the foot of the Karangarua cataracts, and went for a quarter of a mile along a very bad and precipitous hillside into the gorge. It is not so fine as that of the Twain, but, if the latter was not so close, the Karangarua cataract and gorge would strike anyone as a very grand piece of scenery. The only result of this day's work is summed up in my diary. Quote, "The gorge will give us some trouble," end quote. And it did. I now had 9 more wet days, during which the river rose 8 feet, even on the flat, a real old man flood. It must have been very high in the narrow valley by the futtah and in the gorge. It was of course impossible to go up to see the cataracts, but they must have been a wonderful sight. I could see great jets of water shooting up now and then, above the high trees, from the Regina Gorge. On Sunday 18th it cleared up again, so I took a day off and hung everything out to dry and had a general washing of clothes. I do not mean to convey the impression that this was the first time I had washed clothes since leaving Scott's. That very tiresome operation was carried out every week when possible, and as we never took a change except an extra shirt and pair of socks, we had to sit in our blankets while washing and drying the garments. On the 19th I went down to the Futtah for a 50 of flour and some odds and ends. The long spells of wet weather had been rather dismal for me by myself, for it had put all the creeks in flood and prevented any work. It also cut me off from Scott's, because no one could have come up in the present state of the rivers. However, the last 3 notes of the flute had not yet given forth any music, therefore until they did, I had some employment, and if by any chance I had made them sound, then there were reasonable hopes of a tune sooner or later. Stores also were plentiful, and so far there had been no lack of birds, so I was able to spend considerable time in preparing meals of several courses, and in more time in discussing them, for I generally had to cook the next course while eating the one just cooked. The menu on a wet evening, when there was plenty of food and time to cook it, may be interesting. Potage, weka kiwi and pika fern. Poisson, sardine à l'huile. Entrée, sardine à la Karangarua. Relève, boiled kiwi. Légumes, boiled piki fern. Roti, roast weka. Entremet, flapjack and jam. Savoury, sardines on toast. Dessert, 1 dry fig. Sometimes the birds would be roasted on the end of a stick, and on Sundays we allowed ourselves 1 onion, if we had any, by way of a treat. We tried on these swell occasions to imagine our tea was brown sherry. Of course, only in wet weather did I try to raise a smile on my own face by going through the formality of a long dinner. In fine weather there was too much work to do, and when anyone was with me, time did not pass quite so slowly. Sardine à la Karangarua is a rather good dish. Cut a thin strip of bacon, roll a sardine in it, fry for a few minutes, and, as the cookery books say, serve hot on toast. End of chapter 12.